rise. All rise.
As Colorado approached the new 20th century, it was a high-spirited, open-handed state. The vast and varied landscape offered space for many cultures, many styles, many high hopes, and of course, many unfettered ambitions. The natural resources seemed boundlessly plentiful, endlessly diverse. People from all walks of life saw opportunity. For some, opportunity came in the form of exploiting natural resources. For others, opportunity came in the form of freedom, of shrugging off the constraints, the oppressions, and the authority of the Victorian social order. In Colorado, women lawyers came with the territory. On the heels of the abolition movement, women turned their attention to gaining for themselves the right to vote. It would be a half-century after the end of the Civil War before their cause was won, and it would take intensive organization and sometimes confrontation. By the time Colorado became a state, the suffrage movement had a full head of steam. In 1891, one Mary Thomas came before the Supreme Court of the state of Colorado. She petitioned for admission to the Colorado bar. And she was successful. That was 2 years before Colorado became one of the first states in which women could vote. And it was 3 decades before women throughout the United States could vote. The wild and wide west of Colorado was indeed the land of opportunity. In 1914, the energy and hopefulness of the new century was shattered by World War I. The men marched off to Gatling guns and mustard gas. The women filled in behind them on the home front. When Johnny came marching home, he found some mighty independent women. Soon after the end of the war, all women in the United States won the right to vote. What women lawyers learned was that organizing could change not only their own status under the law, but also, sometimes, the law itself. After women achieved suffrage and the men returned from war, however, organization among women faded. Among women attorneys, a thin thread of independence was woven into the next 3 decades. Through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, from Mary Thomas into the future. Emblematic of these rare lawyers was Mary Lathrop, whose legal career spanned the entire first half of the 20th century. Her pride in austere professionalism may have reflected the fact that she was pretty much isolated in a sea of men. Then came World War II. Once again, the men marched off to war. Once again, the women filled in behind, became independent. From upheaval and devastation, they forged new lives. And once again, when the men came back, the women began a retreat to their homes. But this time, their newfound opportunities never quite faded. For on the heels of World War II came the greatest groundswell of organization America has ever known, civil rights and social justice. It would change forever the legal profession in Colorado. The new legal professionals, in turn, would change the face of the law. Our story begins with the pioneers of this great change, rare women lawyers who carried the thread through time. And for one of them, who graduated from law school during World War II, the thread of the story goes back much further. to the independent young businesswoman who was to become the mother of Patty O'Rourke.
She was a little Irish girl from a little town in upper New York State. Her daddy ran the Depot Hotel, which largely survived on the bar. And her mother died in childbirth when she was 7 years old. She had to tumble out of the nest very early in life, and she went to Rhode Island. So this is like 1900, 1901, when she is going to Rhode Island. She went to business school, and this is before the First World War. There was still Victorian, this little Irish girl out of this little New York town. But she was a hard worker, and she was bright and quick to learn, and she was open to learn. But when I told her that I had gone down and registered for law school, and I came home, I went down to New York and registered for law school, and came home and told her I'd done it. She said, well, that's probably a good idea, Patty. and that's all there was to it.
All I can tell you, Caroline, is my earliest memory is 12 years old. I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, and I started getting every book I could find at the public library out there in Los Angeles. I was 14 or 15. I was able to get hold of The Art of Cross-Examination, and I always dreamed of being a lawyer. And then World War II came along, and we decided that was a good time for me to go to law school. And for you young people, it's not so real now, but I remember the last thing he said, because I had my little one. He said, if I don't come back as a lawyer, you'll always be able to take care of our Diane and yourself. And as you had no guarantee you were going to get your loved one back.
My grandfather was a prominent attorney in Kankakee, Illinois, and he was paralyzed for 10 years after he had a stroke. And there were lawyers in our house all the time. His friends came all the time. I lived in that house, and I listened to their war stories sitting out on the porch, and they encouraged me. And there's a woman lawyer in Illinois named Eva Miner, and she passed the bar at the head of the bar, and she was just wonderful, and I loved Eva. She was my family's lawyer.
Well, in my era, you didn't go to college for anything but a ring on your finger. None of us had any kind of professional plans. We went to be in the East, to have a lot of fun at the football games, to be invited to the proms. I was an economics major, but I had no plan to ever use it. And I had many friends whose families could certainly have afforded to send their children to four-year colleges who never thought that it would be worth spending the money on their daughters. So I was very lucky. I had no brother to be preferred, as in many families.
My mother was born in Ireland, Dublin, although she was raised in Cork City. My father was born in Canada and was raised on a farm before he came to this country. They were both teenagers. They came to this country and they met in Minnesota, where they were working. They came here and worked. They never came here to study. When Professor Zubra wanted me to go to law school to meet a proper husband, he picked out Harvard. He said, he didn't say that's where you should go. He says, Zita, that's where you will go to law school, because that's where you can find a proper husband.
I suppose my earliest visions of women were really quite different, because they were the World War II image of women really participating very actively because they had to. I was thinking about law school. I was basically thinking about what can I do that still has the broadest range of things you could do after you graduate. I just was terribly fearful of painting myself in a corner somewhere.
I read Betty Friedan's book. Of course, she's a Smith grad, too. And I don't know how I read it, but when I read it, I kept saying, yes, that's so right, that's so right. And it was a number of years later where I finally got an invitation to belong to Now, where I began to say, yes, this is all correct. There really are some oppressions for women. There really are some deficits. We can be offered only a reduced amount of opportunities in our lives.
My parents both grew up on farms. My mother was the youngest of 10 and my dad was the oldest of 10. But she had taken correspondence courses, and those were in the days when you didn't have to have a college degree in order to go to law school. She had actually gotten herself all accepted into law school at the University of Wisconsin. But when she told her mother about it, her mother, who was this, I never knew her, but she's a stern Germanic face, and she said, well, if you do that, you'll never darken my door again. So my mother backed off and didn't go to law school, and I think as a result of that experience, she wasn't going to stand in any of her kids' way in terms of what we wanted to do.
I grew up in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, which is a suburb on the Kansas side of Kansas City.
I grew up in Topeka, Kansas. My father was a college professor who taught math at Washburn University in Topeka, and my mother was a librarian. I grew up in a place that I guess most people think of as being kind of out of the mainstream, sort of unsophisticated. So I never had anything from my parents except full support for whatever I wanted to do. And I was very lucky in that regard. I think that's probably the most important thing for anyone, is to feel like your family thinks what you're doing is a good thing to be doing.
I had been the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I would say that my family, on the whole, disliked lawyers intensely. That's probably one of the reasons I decided to be a lawyer.
I found that when I graduated from undergraduate school, jobs were extremely difficult for women to get in a managerial profession or a managerial position. So I thought becoming a lawyer would give me the power and the money and the prestige that I must have surely wanted in those days.
I did a lot of other things for a while, including sliming fish, which means cleaning them up in Alaska. I worked in several factories. I did some labor organizing here in Denver. And I realized I wanted the power of being a lawyer, so I went back to law school.
I had, up till that time, been a social worker, and actually found that to be a fairly powerless position to be in. The help I wanted to give people I could never give within the rules and the system.
It has a lot to do with my family and my being raised by sharecroppers. We were a family that helped each other. When I was a young child, I could not prime the tobacco, but I drove the tractor. Everything that you do on a family farm, you do together. And so in that vein, I was listening to adults talk about circumstances or events in the community, and they discussed the need to have a good lawyer. Well, I had been watching Perry Mason, and I decided I can do that. So from an early age, at about 8, I would say that I wanted to be a lawyer.
It fascinated me. My grandfather was a bailiff for a judge down in Trinidad, Colorado, which is where my grandparents are from. And I used to go spend summers with my grandparents, and I'd go to court with him, and I just was absolutely fascinated by the books and I know just everything, the jurors, just anything that had to do with the courtroom just fascinated me, and so I wanted to do that.
You know, I went to college in the mid-60s, and social change was afoot, and trying to, create change, promote change, and help some people. And I think I went into the law with the best of intentions. It was only after I got to law school that I realized it wasn't that easy to affect social change with the law.
I was born and grew up in Superior, Wisconsin. That is a town right on Lake Superior. So my childhood was very snowy and cold. And by the time I moved to Colorado, I thought I was moving to the tropics.